Good afternoon. I love it when those little messages come up saying recording in progress and you get distracted. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for a presentation on everyone's favorite topic, deaccessioning. My name is Darlene Bialeski, and I am the president of the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance. And I'm joined today by several of my fellow board members, and I believe there's going to be at least one founding member in our audience today. We are a group of museum professionals, conservators, and archivists who came together in 2019 to form the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, or as we tenderly refer to it, the CCCA. It is a Vermont nonprofit that was designed to be a resource for our colleagues in small museums, history centers, and other collecting institutions. We also are a resource for those who volunteer in those same places and try to help them with answers to their questions. And of course, if we can't answer the questions, we do direct them to places where they can hopefully get a response if it's out of our purview. And we aid the general public in caring for the heirlooms that they have. Since our inception, we have offered a number of webinars on topics such as inventorying and copyright. We look forward to hearing from you as to what topics you might like us to work on for future presentations. If you have not already, please subscribe to our mailing list, which you can find at www.collectionscarealliance.org, and we'll be putting that in the chat box momentarily, so that you can receive directly into your inbox upcoming events, notices of upcoming events. We also invite you to consider joining the CCCA as a member. There are several levels of membership. Criteria and dues are listed right on our website, so please be sure to visit. I encourage you to join this growing group of individuals who are not only there to share their expertise on various areas that they're working on and to help educate one another, but also to come together to network. And we're there to serve, as I said, our colleagues in professional settings, volunteers, and also the general public. You can find out more about our board and our professional members by looking at the About Us or Membership Directory tab on our website. If you do become a professional affiliate, an emerging professional or student member, then you'll be invited to a number of member-only benefits known as the Conversation with Colleagues. And it's a chance to meet one another, network, and to further a conversation that can be chosen beforehand, or the discussion can be just chosen the day of. This year, we opened up that event to anyone who registered for the webinars to join us the week following the webinar for a conversation with colleagues, and that's just a 1-hour get-together. This webinar's Conversation with Colleagues will be next Thursday at 12 noon for that hour. Matt will join us then to further the discussion on deaccessioning or just be around to network. Today's topic, The Art of Deaccessioning, Tools and Resources, is an introductory discussion of the concept, and it's highlighted by tips that Matt has learned over his 20 years in the field. It's a very broad topic, so there's definitely a possibility of future related webinars to come out of this. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker, who is a professional affiliate of the CCCA. Matt Powers is the executive director of the Woodstock History Center in Woodstock, Vermont. He received his BA in American Studies from Keene State College and an MA in American and New England Studies from the University of Southern Maine. After realizing how culturally rich an environment working for nonprofits is, he decided to dedicate himself to working in the field and has been part of staffs at several historical organizations over his 20 years, including the Remnick Country Doctor Museum and Farm, Sandwich Historical Society, and the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum. Matt has been with the Woodstock History Center now for 7 years and finds great satisfaction knowing that he's working for an organization that focuses on local history and education. We do have a poll that we'd like you to take to measure our audience's level of experience on the topic of deaccessioning and to help us gauge future related webinars. Erica, would you be so kind as to post that poll now, please?
Okay, so that poll should be up on your screen. So the first question is, do you have experience with collections deaccessioning? The second question is, if yes, was your deaccessioning project a success? And the third question is, are you currently considering or about to start a deaccession project? I'll give this poll another minute to 2 minutes to give people a chance to answer before I close it, and we can then receive the results.
I see we are missing maybe a little bit in our poll as to the multiple choices. So Erica, I think maybe if you haven't got many responses, that could be it, and maybe we could just pull out the poll.
Sure. So sorry about that, folks. That's my my error when I constructed this poll. So I'm going to go ahead and close it with just those first 2 questions answered. Looks like a bunch of folks have been able to answer those first 2 questions. So I'm ending the poll now. And I'm going to share the results. So,
okay, so go ahead.
Sorry, Darlene. Looks like about a 50-50 split with people who have experience with deaccessioning or don't. And 38% of people said their project was a success if they had been involved with one. 25% said it wasn't a success, and 38% said mixed results.
Okay, that looks good.
I'm going to go ahead and stop my share.
Okay, thank you everyone who responded to that. And so without without any more delay, Matt, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Darlene. Welcome, everyone. I just wanted to quickly reiterate my thank yous to the CCCA for giving me the opportunity to present to you all today on this sort of broad topic. And I just want to thank Darlene in particular, as she helped me hone this presentation that I hope you can take back to your members of your organization, share it, and hopefully it'll lead future discussions and ultimately lead you to success in the deaccessioning process. So why don't we just get started? As Darlene said, I've worked for a variety of organizations for the last 21 years. One was a farm museum, a historical society that was mostly a volunteer run, a library, and now a history center, which is a bit like more of a museum. And each one of the places went through some form of removing objects from their collection. The Woodstock History Center is the first organization that I've worked for that is really utilized the abandoned property process and the museum property law to formally remove objects. During this talk, I'm going to use the term museum as it refers to an institution that has collections of objects. However, you should review the Vermont museum property law, and they do define museum in broad terms, as we will be talking about later. But I do hope that you can see yourselves in this general survey of deaccessioning, whether you're part of a historical society, a gallery, a library, or other cultural institution. Now, as we get into here, oops, there we go. I just want you to remember, as we're discussing the deaccessioning process, is it's an act of formally removing an object from your collection, but this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are standard practices that you should use to successfully guide your organization through the process. And just a couple real strong points. They seem very simple, but these are really an integral part of the process, is making sure that you don't rush the process. Deaccessioning should be considered one of the tools in your long-term planning for your museum. And above all else, maintaining good records about your process and decision-making is really an integral part of it. And your successors will thank you someday for it. So let's get into it. This is, why would you deaccession in the first place? It seems obvious of why we should do this, but really how many of us have delved into our collections and made hard decisions about why certain objects are in storage or on display. And more importantly, what story are they telling? And this is a good case in point, this photograph that we're looking at. This is a photo from a pantry room in our organization's historic house museum. And you can see by looking at this room that most likely the only reason these objects are on display is that someone long ago either really liked China or they had no other place to put this collection. But a room like this is really a good place to start because it's a reason to ask why these objects are here and to begin the process of what we could call thoughtful pruning. I'm going to get into some points that you can use to begin to think about whether to keep an object or not. Now, there's quite a few here, but we'll try to go through them one at a time and really explore them. The first is an object has limited scope or intended use. The object's time period, significance, provenance, geographic locality, place of origin, cultural tradition does not fall within the collecting scope, your interpretive or exhibit plan, or helps with future research and programming. Status. Are there restrictions associated with the object that limits its use that can no longer be met? Your object can't be stored properly and maintained. The object is found to be a part of a set that belongs to another institution, or the object would be greater use in their collection. The object is of poor quality, does not meet museum standards, or is less important or an incomplete example. Sometimes an object suffers deterioration and restoration is not possible. And you might even find that you have bits and pieces of a full artifact. An object can be discovered to be a fake, a forgery, or perhaps you have a reproduction. An object is composed of or contains hazardous material or is hazardous in itself. And then there's some other factors that contribute to the decision-making process. Again, you might have reproductions. You might actually be sitting on an object that within your organization, somebody considers their sacred cow, and you're never going to be able to get rid of it while they're around. And those are objects that are worth discussing on a broader scale. So let's talk about some deaccessioning policies. And as it says, every museum's collection management policy should contain a section on deaccessioning and disposal. Your policy is the guiding principle and process that everyone collectively agrees to. If you do not have a collections management policy, you should create one before attempting deaccessioning. So let's get into the important components of the policy. I highly encourage you to include as many of these as possible. The first is, who has the authority to deaccession objects? Is it your board, a volunteer, a staff member, a committee? Best practices are that the ultimate decision should reside with your organization's board. However, there are other choices within that. They ultimately, your board could make the informed decision based on a clearly presented recommendation based on your policy. And similarly, are different categories of collections subject to different processes or levels of authority? For example, some museums don't require that deaccessioning books in their non-special library collections need board approval. The next is, what is the criteria for removing an object or objects? I recommend creating a checklist for deaccessioning, which includes things as we saw in the thoughtful pruning section I just referred to. For example, what's the condition of an item? You can rate it from poor to excellent. Another is whether it's hazardous. This is a yes or no question, but you would want to include a comment category that would sort of further stretch that out. I will include a sample of a checklist in the handout that will be provided at the end of the discussion that you can use. It's a pretty well covered checklist of things that would be good criteria. What methods of disposal will your museum allow? And this is really important to flesh out because you might have objects that you want to just deaccession that are not of a quality to go to an auction. Can you give it to a local church annual yard sale? Is there a hazardous waste day that you can bring objects to? Are you allowed to throw something into a dumpster? Is there a box of old bullets that you can bring to a police station? What process does the museum follow to deaccession objects? Who makes the recommendation and to whom? And finally, how are the proceeds from the sale of an object handled? Are the proceeds used for acquisitions or for the direct care of collections? And how does your museum define direct care? A museum must follow procedures that are clear and transparent with the deaccessioning process. It's important to develop a deaccessioning record form, which documents an object's source, criteria checklists, authorizations, and methods of disposal. Now, the first step in the process is conducting an inventory. And if you've never done this before, I recommend reading the actually book titles on the page, Managing Previously Unmanaged Collections, A Practical Guide for Museums by Angela Kipp. Just keep in mind that doesn't mean that you have to inventory your entire collection. You want to start small. It could be a box of things, a room, it could be one type of collection. But one of the things that Angela impresses upon the reader is that you have to start somewhere. You should carve out an area to work in. And once you're in that space, you can determine what you have, and then you can decide what to do with it. Once you've documented that an object resides under your roof, then you will initiate a review of your records. Your records might be in the collections database. A lot of you probably use Past Perfect or some other similar database system. You might have old files, index cards, lists and newsletters. But ultimately what you're trying to determine is whether you have clear title to that object, whether your museum owns the object. So at the beginning of this checklist, we are determining clear title should be determined and any restrictions must be noted. Is there a record of ownership lacking? Was the object never accessioned or fully processed? The process should begin with a justification explaining why the object is a candidate for deaccessioning. Again, a checklist reflecting your policy is very helpful in determining this. And again, any information, including provenance, descriptions, photograph, should be gathered to assist in deliberations and decisions regarding its disposition. The next step in the process is assessing risk. I've included a deaccession risk chart that you can see on the slide. This is from the AAM publication Collections Conundrums and also in museum registrations. So you can see we cover value, disposition method, clarity of title, and object type. Disposition method ranges from destroying an object to an internal transfer. Disposition methods range, I personally think the best option is giving an object to another nonprofit versus moving it around your museum. We'll get to clarity of title in just a few minutes. And then an object type ranges from a very unique item to an abundant one. You can see the abundant is either natural or it can be mass produced. You might have some of those in your collection. I would recommend printing this chart out and put it in a place that you process donations coming in, and also things that are going out. It's just a great chart to keep referring to. It definitely puts things in perspective. I also wanted to include a section on external opinions. And with so much controversy concerning deaccessioning, it's probably wise to consult people outside of your museum. You can consult with specialists, other museum folk. You've got the CCCA. You've got other people that you're hoping that you can solicit their support of a decision for deaccessioning an object, and it could strengthen your proposal. You might need a third-party appraisal of value. You might also need, you might also need legal counsel, depending on any restrictions associated with an object or other concerns. So let's go back to clarity of title and what can be called clouded titles. There are a couple examples of clouded titles. Loans, specifically old loans, are highly problematic as a museum can only make limited use of an object. Sometimes you can't even put it on display, and often determining ownership is impossible. Also, if a museum returns an object to the wrong party, it may open the museum to liability for a claim. I've also listed a promise gift. Promise gifts are something that someone leaves you an object and it's placed in a will, or they've verbally said to you, oh, someday you'll get grandfather's sideboard. That you can consider also a loan. You do not own that object, even if it's in a will document. The next category of high risk is undocumented and FICs, or what's called founding collection objects. Objects are undocumented if they are like other objects in the collection, lack numbers, or any characteristics that might connect them to documentation. But you can resolve their status through careful research. FICs, or founding collection objects, are those undocumented objects that remain without status after all attempts to reconcile them with existing records of collection and loan objects have been exhausted. To deal effectively with undocumented and FIC objects, you should first try to establish legal title. Once the museum has proof of ownership of the object should be assigned an accession number, as it should have been assigned much earlier, so that deaccessioning documentation can be tracked and properly filed. Any of these types of documentation that you see on your screen can establish legal title to the object. So often you'll see deed of gifts, probably the best one to have, right? Because they're signed by the museum representative and the donor. You might have a purchase order or a receipt. Somebody bought this and said, here you go, or you might have bought it yourself. The session card file, which lists the year acquired, a session number, object, description, and name of donor. You might have accession binders or folders with the same information as a card file, but it also has the date of object when it was received. There might be other records like inventories from other organizations showing title to the objects donated. For example, the Woodstock History Center received a large portion of their collections from the Daughters of American Revolution when they essentially removed their organization from our town. They had a huge inventory. We have binders full of stuff. They're not exactly the tried and true method, because when they inventoried, they'd say something like chair. Well, we might have 50 chairs from the DAR. So you have to still get into it a little bit and determine that, but it gets you started. You also might have articles in your organization's newsletters. Go back and read them. It was pretty standard back in the day to list everything that was received in that month or quarter or that year, and you can find them in your newsletters. And often when you look at earlier newspapers, A lot of organizations would say, hey, we just got the sideboard and this was the donor. Those are really great resources. Or you might have other periodicals or publications that you can refer to. Meeting minutes or correspondence from your institutional records, where an object is discussed in the official record of the organization, is a good place to create legal title. But once you determine the object's legal title, you can then proceed to deaccessioning process, which we will outline further when we get to our legal standards. Notifications. The museum will need to consider its public and its responsibility to deaccession with transparency. While it's generally recommended that a public notification of deaccessioning is created, each of your organizations should decide how this should occur within the purview of state law. Okay, so you might feel like you need to publish this broader to your members or to your board or whoever your constituency is. But when we get into state law, you can see sort of the parameters on which they dictate a notification. The last part of the deaccessioning process is disposal. You may or may not remove any numbers or other markings from objects. Each organization should decide whether or not they will do this. Some organizations like to keep them. Some auction houses want you to keep them for provenance, but that's something you could maybe sort of spell out in your management policy. And I'll keep saying it over and over, record keeping is paramount. You want to track everything that you do and how you've done it with the object. So here's some standard methods of disposal. The most suitable method of disposal must be determined on a case-by-case basis and may vary depending on the object. No deaccessioned object should be acquired by a museum staff person, board members, volunteers, or their relations. This is considered a conflict of interest. Probably the best method of disposal is a donation to another museum, a library, an archive, or another cultural institution, nonprofit. You might make an exchange of items between cultural institutions and bolstering both of your collections. You can transfer an object within your institution to an education collection or sometimes a utility collection. Maybe an old hammer is actually useful for you in whatever capacity of your facilities maintenance. There's recycling and destruction, repatriation and restitution to rightful owners. That's a fairly large topic, and hopefully that'll become part of a dialogue in next week's conversation. And then you could have a public sale, a public auction, or another event. I recommend listing what those events are or what your sales are in your policy. Is it something that you guys do that is an annual auction to benefit your organization? Are you doing a yard sale? And you're going to want to really detail those out. So let's get to the last section on legal, ethical, and professional standards associated with deaccessioning. Now, museums in the United States are expected to act for the benefit of the public. Laws and regulations establish minimum standards for conduct of museum operations. And there are many states that have developed museum property laws which empower a museum to claim ownership over objects which lack documentation. Now, professional codes of ethics promote even higher standards. Many states have laws concerning museum property, and each participant should be aware of their specific state law or lack of it. I'm only speaking today about the museum property law and what's commonly referred to the abandoned property process in Vermont. I don't know if there are people here from outside of Vermont, but you definitely want to check your state statute about that. A little background about this, this law. I don't want to speak for those who actually did it, and I wasn't a part of the organization, but from my understanding, A lot of this started at the American Precision Museum, and back in 2006 or so, they received a fairly large grant to begin an inventory process. And they went through that over the course, I think, of a year, and they determined that they had over 1,200 objects that were found in collection. They had no idea where they were from, and they didn't have any methods of getting rid of these objects or determining just clear title to get the process going. So Ann Lawless, who was the executive director at the museum at the time, and her board chair, Gil Whittemore, sort of spearheaded their efforts to create legislation on the museum property law. And they also worked with other museum professionals around the state. So ultimately, that culminated into, in 2008, the state actually passed the museum property law. I've got that in the handouts as well, so you can go and refer to it, and you can also go online, which I've created a link to it on this next slide. It's fairly straightforward, but you should definitely familiarize yourself with it. But the gist is of the Vermont statute of museum property law in Vermont is that the museum can claim ownership over an object if it published a notice of abandonment in its local newspaper for 3 consecutive months, and then waits 180 days after the last notice to see if any claims on the object. If there are no claims, then the museum has official ownership. I asterisk that on my notes, the local newspaper. We in Woodstock have a number of newspapers in our local area. We chose to go with the Valley News, which was a little bit more all-encompassing on several towns versus our local paper, because a lot of the donations over the years, our actually mission back in the day was Windsor County. So we felt that we needed to cover a little bit larger ground. Your institution might be more locally focused to your town, and you might not have to do that. Or you might even not have a local newspaper. So I would definitely do a little bit of detective work on what's the best option for you. But really, it's posting something in the newspaper and doing it for 3 months. Now, the first time we did that here at the History Center, going through the abandoned property process, was in 2013. And at that time, we only listed 191 items. After we did that and we gained ownership, we actually went to, some of them went to a public sale, some of them we kept. But at the time when I came in, we realized that we were just scratching the tip of the iceberg. So we spent about 5 or 6 years really intensively inventorying our collection. So the next time we went through the abandoned property process in 2019, we actually listed 1,215 objects. And that's a huge, huge increase of almost 1,000 items. Now, when we did that, we realized that this massive list, the cost associated with running a substantial ad listing all these items would be huge. So we actually reached out to the Vermont State Archivist, and they gave us permission to post a simple notice of abandonment in the paper and include language that a list of objects would be found on our website. And this significantly decreased the advertisement price and the financial burden to gain control over the collection. We also made a hard copy of all the items so that someone could view it in our office. We put it in a binder. But for the main gist, it was really wanted to have it transparent and on our website. And that way we could also list the reasons why we are doing it. Because some people think abandoned property is, oh, you're just giving stuff up. Well, the wordage is a little odd. We're not abandoning anything. We're just trying to gain title. But again, make sure you go ahead and read your state statute as it pertains to where you live. So let's get into a little bit of the ethics surrounding deaccessioning. It's considered best practice when the deaccessioning process follows professionally accepted ethical standards. Transparent policies and procedures for thoughtful and careful deaccessioning and disposal can help your museum mitigate the risk of ethical controversy. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard some of those controversies related to deaccessioning, and probably the most prevalent ethical controversy concerning the deaccessioning of objects is the monetizing of objects. You know, the biggest one you hear about are art pieces from large museums that gets the attention of the public. But I think it's important to remember that collections are not here to preserve our museum. The museum is here to preserve the objects and the collections. And I think I can quote something that sums this up pretty well. So, although objects in a museum's collection may have monetary value, once they become part of a museum collection, that value becomes secondary to their importance to help us understand our world and ourselves. That's why the appraised value of the collection is typically not carried on a museum's balance sheet. It is not reported along with cash assets on its IRS Form 990. So the last part of the deaccessioning process is realizing the possible proceeds from the sale of objects. According to the AEM Code of Ethics for museums, funds realized from the sale of deaccessioned items may be used only for the acquisition or direct care of collections. Funds should not be used to provide financial support for institutional operations, facilities maintenance, or any other reason other than preservation or acquisition. So let's define those two terms. Acquisitions is pretty straightforward. Acquisition refers to the replacing the object with another that has relevance, importance, or use in the museum's mission. Direct care is the investment in your existing collection to enhance its life, usefulness, or quality. When it comes to utilizing funds for building projects, your museum should determine whether or some of its historic structures and landscapes will be treated as part of its collection. If they are, you should have that in your collections management policy. A distinction should be noted between building maintenance and preservation. You can also note that in 2014, the National Trust for Historic Preservation published a revised collections management policy that established historic structures and landscapes as part of a museum's collection, and therefore they qualify for deaccessioning funds under the direct care principle. For example, our museum, we have an 1807 historic house, and we have yet to list it as a collections item. But we've had to build up some capacity to talk about that on our collections committee, at our board level, and there is already consensus in the organization that our historic house is our largest collections item. So then we have to start working on our policy and making sure that we determine that's what we're saying, and then that'll kick in some of the fund usage. The Woodstock History Center, to help expedite those two things, we actually created two restricted funds. I know not everyone's a big fan of creating lots of checking accounts, but we have one that is a capital reserve fund that's just for building maintenance or capital projects. And we also created a collections fund, which is acquisition and direct care. Now, if we list our historic house as our large collection item, we can use collections fund money for the preservation of those buildings, i.e. fixing the historic windows. Maybe there's a mantelpiece that needs addressing, if there's paint. But you have to delineate between what maintenance is and what preservation is. Ultimately, if you have funds that can accomplish those two tasks, you can marry those together so that your project is more robust. So we're proceeding in the next year, in 2022, to really enhance our policy and include our historic structure. Well, let's get into claims briefly. While it's highly unlikely that someone's going to show up and make a claim on that old chair or a teacup, You should be ready to respond promptly should it happen. Just remember, ultimately, that the law leans towards the museum and the burden of proof resides in the claimant. If the proof, if you look at the last bullet, if the proof is strong, what's the worst thing that can happen? Your museum returns the object and it goes to its rightful owner. But if the proof is weak, you should reject the claim in writing. And that'll start a statute of limitations, which usually is about 3 to 6 years. You want to check in with your state laws concerning that. And if someone wants to bring a suit against you, that's what they'll do. But at least it gives you a little bit of time to digest, perhaps, that someone's going to make a claim. But again, it has to be written. It has to be in a will. It has to say, yes, my grandfather gave me the pink chair that's has this documentation, and here's the photo. It's pretty often that the proof is weak. So here are some takeaways that hopefully you can act on. You're going to walk into your museum tomorrow, and these are the things you're going to do right off the bat. You always want to properly document everything that comes into your museum with an incoming loan form or a deed of gift. If a donor, somebody you know, walks in and does not want to take the time to fill out a form, you don't want it. Your organization does not want an object without any documentation. You want to try and reduce or limit any restrictions placed on an object. Long-term loans, I'm sure some of you have those. Just say no. There's no such thing as a long-term loan anymore. All loaned objects should have a fairly short time limit associated with it. We renew every one of our loan objects on a 2-year basis. So if somebody comes in tomorrow, it kicks in a 2-year, and it might be on a basis where things are at different time schedules, but we keep a list and we send the loan forms to the people every time that 2-year hits. And they might decide that they want to continue that loan, but ultimately you just want to make sure that you're keeping your documentation to date. It's when years go by and all of a sudden it turns into 30, 40, 50 years and this is a loan and it becomes a long-term loan. You have no idea who gave that and who you should contact. You might go, oh, the person is deceased. So don't do long-term loans. You never want to accept an object that the donor says must be returned if you don't want it anymore. That's, again, it's almost like a long-term loan. It might be 50 years from now, and then how do you determine who to return it to? And there might be contesting of a will, or you just don't know where they live anymore. You should think of the story your museum is telling or will be telling in the future, and see if you can find objects that support it. I think, at least we found, you'll be amazed when you come up with an idea for an exhibit and you try to find objects to support it. And you'll realize how many objects are actually really irrelevant to your mission. Case in point, we did an exhibit last year. It's called Hindsight 2020. And we were telling sort of the story of Woodstock. And as we went to say, well, what are the objects that can bolster that story? Boy, did we have a wake-up call. When we told women's right to vote, we had nothing. We didn't have a sash. We didn't have anything that could tell that story. We had the same barn full of chairs and glassware and all of those things that do have some relevance, but ultimately you're trying to tell a larger story, and you should make sure that your objects do that. You want to make your objects accessible. You want to know what's in those records and establish ownership status. One of the steps that we did here, because we had the space, is we took all of our records that were all over our place, library records, collections records, and we relocated it in one space. And just by having them in one space, we were able to just navigate through trying to find title or where an object was, and it helped us really get organized. And then lastly, you should know and understand your state's abandoned property law. It's really, really important to know it. That's fairly straightforward, but you should determine what that is, and that'll help you start the process. So with that said, I've added some tools and resources. This list will be on your handout, as well as this full PowerPoint presentation. I've also included all of the bullet points in a PDF. So if you want to take this back and use it for other people in your organization or your board, you can do so. But ultimately, I hope this helps you kind of just start the discussion around the deaccessioning process. As Darlene said, next week, you can join another conversation with colleagues about deaccessioning. I will be there if you have any further questions. But I hope this was helpful in getting you started on sort of that general survey of deaccessioning. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt, for that great webinar. I hope that those of you with just a little of experience or no experience have a better understanding now of the deaccessioning process and how that plays an important role in the area of collections care, and that you're going to be more comfortable approaching the task at your institution when you get to that point. And those of you with some experience, hopefully you've picked up a tip or two. Do we have any questions from the audience? See.
We do have a couple questions that are coming in through the chat. One question is, how do we get the packet of information from Matt? And sorry, Darlene, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that was the next point I was going to raise, that I linked to the recording of this presentation and the PDF of all the materials that Matt mentioned, his slide deck, his talking point, his wonderful materials he pulled together as checklists and samples, as well as some other very important materials will all be included in that PDF and will be included with the link to the recording that should be sent out in the next several days. So watch your inbox for that.
Thank you, Darlene. Another question's come in from Nancy about repatriation. And she's wondering if that's going to be covered in next week's discussion. And I will go ahead and just take the liberty of saying that it certainly can be, but Nancy, if you have something specific question that you'd like to raise today, please feel free to jump in.
It's a big topic.
It's a very big topic.
Yeah.
While we're waiting, yes, absolutely. And while we're waiting for Nancy to decide whether she wants to ask her question or not, I just want to mention a point of transparency here. Matt had mentioned the wonderful book my colleague Angela Kipp wrote about managing previously unmanaged collections. And I am a ghost editor for that book. Angela is German as a primary speaking language, so she asked me to read through the manuscript when she was writing it to be sure that her English, which is excellent, translated solidly and everything made sense. So I just want to make that point. But another reason for you to do your inventorying beyond knowing what you have in your collection is also to know what your records say you should have in your collection, because there might be the point of when we're talking about long-term loans. In one of my previous experiences on staff at an institution I won't name, there were decades wherein the board decided they wanted to borrow things from the institution, or the staff at the institution decided they wanted to be very good to their city government and would lend paintings and sculpture out to various offices. By the time I came on board, there was no record of that. And then one day out of the blue, I got a phone call saying, yeah, we're repainting so-and-so's office, and we see that there's some paintings with your museum's label on the back. Do you want them back? Well, somehow these were missed off of the inventories that were done before I came on board. And certainly, you know, this was a point of, do we even want these? So they were set aside for deaccessioning, but it's just another instance that you need to know what's in your collection, but also maybe what's not there and your records say you do own. So we do have a couple of other questions here.
Actually, just real quick, Darren, I was just thinking in my head, how many times over the years that it seems like every organization I've worked for, I've walked in the door and about a month later, somebody calls and says, guess what? We're selling our house and our barn is full of artifacts. You should come look. And I've literally gone to a barn and seen the whole barn filled with haymaking equipment and you have a week to get it out. And every place I go to has that question. So it'll come to bite you. So the idea of no longer wanting long-term loans, it's really for the future. It's for somebody that you're helping out 50 years from now, is really the case. You don't want to leave that legacy behind you.
It's absolutely right. Clean up your books and your inventory and your collections as you can, of course, taking it in chunks of time and chunks of objects, because you don't want to overwhelm yourself, the volunteers you have working with you, or your staff, and you want to make sure that you can progress through the whole process to the end result and not stop midstream. So many institutions get started on deaccessioning projects and then get pulled aside to do something else that seems to be more of a priority, and they never seem to get back to finishing the deaccessioning project while everyone who worked on it is still available to continue the process. So just want to make sure that you figure out what you need to do and the time allotment, and then who's going to be involved. We did have a question here. Erica, did you see the one on insurance? I seem to have lost that here.
Sure, I'll read that question from the chat, and then I also see that Karen has raised her hand. So Karen, we'll get to you momentarily. So this question in the chat came from Jennifer, who says, Matt recommended that we not take on long-term loans. Another reason for not taking a long-term loan on might be insurance. Does Matt have any thoughts about that?
Sure. Well, I think talking about insurance, one, does everyone have collections insurance? You should look into that. Two, you should look into what's listed. We've done the same thing, is we renew our policy every year and we never check actually what our insurance agent knows about us. Sometimes there's new agents associated with your account. So you should do a little survey on your insurance. We have a certain limit, obviously, on our insurance that covers a sort of all-encompassing policy, but we have decided that we're going to list sort of the top 20 most valuable, and that can be aesthetic, just monetary value. It could be cultural importance, and that sort of hones some of that down. I would probably guess if an agent was talking about insurance policy and you said we have long-term loans, they would probably discourage that of having that. And if there's something located on your insurance that dictates a long-term loan, that actually might be a way of determining a title to something. That's another avenue I didn't really think of, but it could very well be, and it might be listed from years and years ago. But again, get rid of the long-term loan idea. What you just want to know is, this is what we've got. This is what we find valuable. Otherwise, we don't want it. And if there are restrictions placed on an object, for us, it's related to past archival materials that have financial information that's current, i.e. we have like a local group here that they actually have their stocks located here. And fundraising, I could open up that box and determine all of the wealth in this town, but they put restrictions on that. They don't want anyone knowing who those people are. Other restrictions might be with personal records that a family doesn't want anyone to know about. Again, we didn't make that decision when they came in. We didn't put those restrictions on, but we carry those forward. But they're interesting to note, and it helps you, informs you for future decisions on whether you would put a restriction on objects. I hope I answered that question.
Thank you, Matt. Karen, what can we help you with?
Karen, you have to unmute. Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I just was asking, I hope that maybe there could be a little further discussion about avoiding conflict of interest. It's so often a problem that someone on the board is offered ownership of a about to be deaccessioned object, and sometime with no thought to its past or future. And just wondered if you have further guidance on that subject. Thank you.
Sure. Go back to your policy making. Your policies guide your organization, and you should renew your conflict of interest policies for your members of your board every year. All that should be on your hit list. It's so easy to lose track of it as new board members come in and old board members leave. But as long as you are educating them, if this is what our expectation is, and you broadly discuss that at a board level, there should be no confusion about it. If it does arrive, then whoever is your board chair, your board president, or you should have an executive committee, someone needs to deal with it. That's not a staff member or someone who is working on the operations. That can be difficult, but there are little tools like, actually another organization I worked for, and I carried that here, is we moved our nominating committee and we actually renamed it as Committee on Trustees. And yes, nominations are a part of what they do, but they're also empowered to police the board. So if a conflict of interest arises, or they don't show up, and you need them to show up so they can vote on certain things, that committee is empowered to act on that. Because conflict of interest, there could be liability associated with that. And if they decide to go ahead and put the organization at risk, that's a big problem. So at least you can cover yourself legally by making sure that they sign that conflict of interest policy. You can't always dictate how things happen, but you do your best.
Thank you.
Karen, can I ask if you're extending that conflict of interest to a board member wanting a particular item that's been deaccessioned before it leaves the premises?
Yes, I think I did experience something like that in the past, not currently, but yes.
Okay, so a couple of points, as Matt has mentioned throughout his presentation, your collections management policy is a very, very important tool. There should be a line item in there that talks about not only the conflict of interest and that annually signed document, but also that it's unethical for a trustee, a board of directors, whatever the title is of the individuals that are serving to protect and take care of that collection. Their fiduciary responsibility is unethical for them to assume ownership of something that you are deaccessioning. Many of the institutions that I have worked for and that I consult for, when objects are deaccessioned, they are not even offered back to the family complementarily. The family is told that they're going to be sold at such and such auction. The board of directors is told they're going to be sold at such and such auction. And the individual wishes to purchase the object, they can do that through the normal channels of a public auction. But it's unethical for them to be sitting on a board where they have a fiduciary responsibility to care for the objects, to then presume they have the right to take possession of an object that is being deaccessioned complementarily.
And so Karen, also watch, when you talk about those other sales events, whether it's your own yard sale or things, and that certain prices are fixed, then that person could say, well, I'll just go to the yard sale and pick it up for that $20. I think you just really need to impress upon them that you have a chance of purchasing that at a public auction, but maybe one of these other events within your policy should dictate that the ethics go against you buying it at one of those events.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Matt, we do have a point or two about NAGPRA. Does your collection have anything where you've had to repatriate through NAGPRA?
No, we haven't.
Okay. if that is of interest to some of you who have, Nancy and Andrea, who have mentioned it in the chat, let us know if that's a workshop you'd like us to consider doing for the CCCA for next year's programming. So you can just drop us an email and let us know if that's something that you'd like us to try to put together.
And I'll just note, Margaret Tamulonis, the collections manager of the Fleming Museum, has done
Yes.
NACA for us, 2 processes. First, returning human remains, and then providing lists back to tribes. And it's an ongoing process, right? It's
Yes.
about establishing relationships as well as sort of meeting the letter, but also the spirit. And that's
Right.
something we always need to be working on.
Exactly. And it's a long and arduous and very detailed process as well. Not as easy as deaccessioning. Do we have some other questions from you, or did Matt just do such a phenomenal job? He answered all of your questions before you even wondered what the questions were.
Yeah, we're done. This is it. You guys are all done. Congratulations.
Can we hear from some of you who came in with maybe little experience as to whether you feel you've gotten a few more points now and or you feel more comfortable? That is, if you want to share that with us.
Hi,
Hi there.
this is Ann Valentine. I'm just recently becoming involved in the West Windsor Historical Society. And we have a lot of stuff, boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff. And I think it's been really helpful today to the idea to look at that and look at it compared to our mission and see, does this stuff, everything from milk cans to, I mean, just stuff, support the mission of the Historical Society. I think that's going to be a really helpful exercise to see what stays and what goes.
And I
Exactly.
called up that tools and resources page.
Yeah, thank you.
Halfway in there, you'll see it says a manifesto for active museum collections.
Yeah,
I would just read that.
okay.
I'm not advocating for one thing or another, but it's a little bit of an eye opener about, and at the time I think it came out, it was just cutting edge and everyone's like, oh my gosh. But now you read it and you go, oh yeah, that's just what we should all be doing. And it really comes down to storytelling. And, you know,
Right.
you can have stuff, but ultimately, at least I've always believed that if there's something of value, and I'm not talking about monetary value, that
Mhm.
sits in a closet for 100 years, it's not worth anything.
You're right.
You know what
And
I
right
mean?
now, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm want to suggest is that we get everything out of the space we have into a big, well-lit space
Yeah.
where we can look at it and say, let's figure this out. But right now we've got so much stuff that we don't have a museum. You know what I mean? We cannot do an exhibition because of the stuff. We're a storage facility.
Yeah. And I'm sure you have things that you're exhibiting that is basically storage on display, which is, you know, so, I mean, just like us, I showed you that picture of that room.
Yep.
And
Yep.
we all do it, but there are places even locally, and I know Norwich Historical Society really went through with a fine-tooth comb. I've gone through their facility and I was like, wow, look what they're doing now, because they have really gone through and said what's crucial. And then it also leads you to saying, what are we missing?
Mm-hmm.
That's the exciting part, is finding what's missing from your collection that is really going to tell West Windsor's story. And
Exactly.
how wonderful, because then you start making connections, and ultimately it's going to come down to the story you're telling is about people, and the
Mhm.
stuff is there to tell that story, or whatever.
Right.
And it might not be people, it might be environment as well, but
Right.
ultimately you're talking about the built environment, and
Right.
it's an exciting place. It's hard because you know, if you are able to create a space where you can lay everything out, let me know, because I'd love to participate in that.
Okay,
I'd love to bring
all
my
right.
stuff over too.
Yeah.
But you carve out a spot if you can, and label it sacred cows
Yeah,
and make that pile and really explore what the definition of that is and why is it important. Because there are things here that I will not be able to get rid of because there's a certain person here. But those things are valuable to some extent because they hold meaning in some other level. But most of those people in that sort of generation of just keep everything, that's changing. And
Yeah.
it's time to, again, be active and make tough choices.
and if there's one thing we need to do is tee our organization up for the next generation. That's the short-term mission. Get it ready for the next group of leadership. So
Yeah.
this has been super helpful. And we'll be getting this screen so I can grab those links.
Yep, everything is in there. I threw the whole kitchen sink in there for you, Ann.
Okay, great.
But remember, I think to everybody is, pick up the phone. Again, reach out to the other people. The beauty of the CCCA is that it's creating this wonderful Vermont networking system. And there's some really great expertise that you can just, even if you had a quick question. And so really start networking and realize you're not alone in this process.
Thank you, Matt, for that. And Anne, one other point for you as well is for preparing for that next generation. Now might be the time for you and your board to start looking at your local area to see who might be in that quote unquote next generation that you might want to start inviting in onto the board. Because you'll all get to the point where, retirement and life takes another direction and you don't want to leave the good work that you've put in sort of sagging and left behind. You want to keep moving it forward so that your collections are saved for posterity and that future generations can always enjoy them as well. And as Erica has mentioned in the chat box, all of today's presentation and the Q&A session have been recorded. And again, the link will be sent out in the next few days with Matt's handout, which is his entire PowerPoint slide deck, his points of discussion, some sample templates he's included for you, and his tools and resources list. So did we miss any questions, Erica?
We do have another discussion thread in the chat, which was kicked off by Ivy. How would you go about with outreach to other institutions in reference to donating or exchanging objects? Any helpful tips?
Let's see if I'm not seeing that question. Can you repeat it one more time, Erica? I'm sorry.
Sure. How would you go about with outreach to other institutions in reference to donating or exchanging objects as part of the deaccessioning process?
Well, it's an interesting, another point of networking is, the hard part is we don't always know what's under our own roof. How would we know what's under everyone else's? So I think I would just sort of draw a circle around your organization and determine sort of who resides within the county or whatever the region that you live in, and sort of look at similar organizations to begin with. If you're a local organization, local historical society, or local focus, then you can sort of just pick up the phone and say, hi, we're looking for things. Do you have Woodstock things? We have Hartford things or Heartland things? And that begins at least a dialogue. And it's probably less about the object. It's more of like, oh, how do you guys do this? And who's in charge of it? And you get a better sense of we're kind of all in this together. I think that's probably the first step. It's probably a longer discussion about exchange of objects. It's really just starting the networking process. Would you agree with that, Darlene, Erica?
Definitely, because it not only gives you the opportunity to first know what's in your collection, but to reach out and find out what is in the collections of those around you, and then to network with those colleagues, because the bigger relationship circle you can build within your local area, you might have to reach out a little farther if there isn't anyone in your quote unquote local area. but the more you can gain with learning about things that you didn't realize you might be needing to do. Maybe you're not sure if you're doing a certain procedure the correct standard and best practice way. So you start having those discussions, you start learning what others are doing, and then you are finding out that you are not alone, and that you have this whole new circle of colleagues that you can call up and say, I'm having this difficulty, or where can I get this, or how do I do that? And then as an umbrella to all of you, the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance would love to be that resource that you can also reach out to find out maybe who is in your local area, or who is in the state, or who is in New England that we're dealing with. So the more you can engage yourself with networking with your other colleagues in the area, the more enriched your work will be that you're doing for your institutions.
And I also, just to, not to beleaguer the point, but, when COVID happened, like the best thing that happened to me was that I had even just a small network of local people who were in my same position. And we met, as much as we could every month, every couple of months, just like, how's it going? You're still working at home or whatever. And it became less about objects. It just became about, again, relationship building. And that's a wonderful thing, because we're not in competition with each other. We're all working towards the same goal, which is to enhance an appreciation of history and education. So again, reach out, pick up the phone. We can get so used to not looking outside our window that it becomes very isolating and you feel like you're overwhelmed. And so, as Darlene says, start talking to people. This is a great chance. And I don't know if the CCA, I think they were going to have sort of regional in-person meetings that sort of got broken up by COVID. But if they come back, that's a great example of, step up and become a leader and say, I'll be a host site. It doesn't have to be fancy. You can just have somebody on your lawn. And then when you have those meetings, when you get the list of who's participating, you might go, well, hey, how come so-and-so's not there? That organization just lives down the street. And you should engage them and say, you should be here. And that will help, again, that networking and bolstering that, the appreciation and the professionalism on the state of Vermont.
Because for some of you that are in historical societies that may or may not belong to your state historical society or the New England Museum Association, there's probably very little networking that you think or that you've been able to do simply because you don't know who else is out in the area, or that you didn't know that you could actually just reach out and talk to someone. So again, not to belabor the point, but pick up that telephone or come to events that you see advertised. Check. So I'm going to say this again, make sure that you subscribe to our mailing list, and it's so easy to do. Just visit our website, and at the bottom of every page is a link to subscribe. And by that, you'll get notice of upcoming events. And if you're not wanting to get a lot of emails, then periodically check our website. You'll find a number of things under workshops and events tab to just, broaden your horizons. There are lectures there that are given by our professional affiliates, our board members, some of our founding members, things that are upcoming. So you'll want to check that out. And I also really encourage you to check out the requirements of our membership and consider joining us as a professional affiliate, an emerging professional, or a student, and just, start taking part in this growing and very rich group of networking individuals who are in the profession and there to help everybody. That's what it is. There's no competition. It's how can I help you? Erica, do you have anything else to add to that?
Thank you, Darlene. I just wanted to invite Andrea to also respond to Ivy's question about outreach, since I noticed that she put a little bit of a response in the chat.
Sure. By the way, Andrew Rosen at the Fleming Museum, and I hope I'm not sounding like a know-it-all in the chat, but haven't formally deaccessioned yet, but have been thinking about it for all 6.5 years I've been here, including in those instances of like, hey, who should this go to? So we had some duck stamp prints, and I found like a birds museum in Wisconsin that was interested. I was just looking at a piano with some prominent Vermont families associated with it and have reached out to the historic house associated with those families. Haven't heard back yet, but I'm hopeful, because if it couldn't go to them, who else could it go to? So, you know, always thinking creatively about that tie, I think, between the subject matter of the place and the subject matter of what you're trying to dispose of or transfer or exchange.
Yeah, excellent point. Thank you for sharing that. So any other questions? I know that some people have had to start to leave for other obligations, but we want to give one last chance for any questions for today. And as you're thinking, continue thinking and look to join us next week, next Thursday at 12 noon for a conversation with colleagues, just an hour long. Matt, myself, and some other board members will be joining, and we can continue the deaccessioning topic. We can answer questions that you might have between now and then, or we can chat about whatever it is that might be pressing for you. So if it looks like we're wrapping up, then I would say thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. And if you have any questions, contact us at the Collections Care Alliance at gmail.com. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, Darlene.
Thank you, everybody.